faces tonight, welcome. Older faces, please keep coming back. We want to announce two speaker series tonight, not one. We have next month a talk on the Civil War. David Albert was once a professor at Air Force Academy doing stuff at Osher, which is where he met him, and he's going to do a talk on the Civil War. Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition is going to come and talk about past history and current agenda in December. It's not on your schedule, but Oliver Boyd, who runs the August Wilson Center downtown, is going to come and talk about how that center developed and what it's doing now. So that's our January lecture. I have a funny question for you. Did anyone see a program on WQED on Squirrel Hill last month? Anyone? Okay. On the 22nd or 29th of this month, which is what I was just checking if I missed the dates, there's going to be a program on QED in the evening on Squirrel Hill. Yours truly was interviewed and others. We will get the time for that and put it on the internet site. So look for that. Anyone have any questions before we get started? Any about future programming or whatever? Our walking tour this year is going to be at Chatham again, this first weekend in June, the first Saturday. We've done it before, but there's some new gardens there, and Chatham's always an interesting place to go. How many of you know already about the Meadowcroft Rockshelter? I believe most of you do. We're very happy to have James Adovasio, who was primarily responsible for the excavations at that rock shelter, been kind enough to come down from Erie tonight to speak to us. Dr. Adovasio was at Pitt for a while and lived, as he told me, down in Avella to talk about that, where the rock shelter is. He's originally from Youngstown, went out west, and as he told me, to his surprise, found himself back in the east. He now runs the archaeology and anthropology program at Mercyhurst College up in Erie. And without further ado, Doctor.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. What I would like to do this evening is to kind of pursue a series of related themes with you. Obviously, I want to talk to you about Meadowcroft Rockshelter and the history of the research that was conducted there, but I also want to contextualize it in terms of broader questions that relate to what we currently understand about the peopling of the New World, the initial occupation of this hemisphere, and when that event might have transpired. I also want to talk to you at the same time about some of the aspects of science which many of you are familiar with, which kind of inhibit us from changing our minds about pre-existing perspectives, why it is so hard to alter our view on a variety of topics, not the least of which is the initial human presence in the New World. So without further ado, is it not full, right? Okay. As all of you know, we just celebrated formally, or are about to celebrate, the arrival on October the 12th, 1492 of Cristoforo Colon, the soon-to-be styled Admiral of the Ocean Seas, either on San Salvador or some other island in the Caribbean, perhaps Samana Cay, where he almost immediately encountered its soon-to-be exterminated Aboriginal inhabitants, the Taino. About these folks, he posed, or more accurately, members of his entourage posed a series of questions which in one way or another we've been asking ever since. First, who are these people? Secondly, from whence did they come? Third, via what means, via what routes did they get here? Fourth, and probably most vexatiously, when did they initially arrive? And finally, a question they didn't pose, but which we will try to address based on the Meadowcroft work. What were their lifestyles like? What were these first inhabitants of the New World actually doing? Columbus, of course, thought he had the answers to most of his questions, convinced as he was that he had landed in the East Indies and not the West Indies, the folks that he encountered must therefore be Indios or Indians, and they were so named. Also, given the literal interpretation of the book of Genesis which obtained at the time, they must have always been there. So a question of homelands, a question of roots, a question of timing really didn't obtain at all. It would not be until 1513, when Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama, that it became apparent, at least to educated Europeans, that the New World indeed was a separate place from the Old World, that Columbus in fact had landed in the West and not the East Indies, and therefore all these questions resurrected themselves. Interestingly enough, it led to a wild series of speculations by armchair scholars who said the first Native Americans were, and you can pick your favorite here, wandering Egyptians, wandering Phoenicians, wandering Israelites, wandering Greeks, anyone who could have somehow floated across the Atlantic and landed in the New World. Or, if you prefer, they were floating Japanese, Chinese, or Southeast Asians, if you prefer the Pacific route. Interestingly, amidst all this speculation, several individuals correctly assessed from whence the peopling of the New World probably occurred. 100 years after Columbus's death, a Spanish Jesuit priest working in Chile, named José de Acosta, produced a rather remarkable document called the Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, the natural and moral history of the Indies, in which he said, based on their physical appearance, it was obvious to him that the source of Native Americans was Northeast Asia. This is a fairly remarkable observation. If any of you have seen maps of Northeast Asia at the time, it's essentially unmapped. The entire area east of the Ural Mountains was called Tartary, and this was 114 years before Vitus Bering, in the service of the Russian Tsar, would sail into the straits now bearing his name. Also remarkable was the fact that De Acosta said they walked here, dry-shod, across what he postulated must have been a land connection between Northern Asia and northernmost North America. He even provided the first of what would become a fluctuating series of dates as to when this event might have occurred, and said it was about 2,500 years before the arrival of Columbus. Fast forwarding a little bit. In 1648, Thomas Gage, an Englishman, said the exact same thing, that the source of Native Americans was northeastern Asia, and thereafter followed a series of more speculations because nobody paid any attention to either Gage or to De Acosta. And it would not be until a series of seminal developments occurred in the intellectual history of Europe that the wisdom, if you will, the foresight of De Acosta's pronouncements would become apparent. Part of that would occur between 1831 and 1833, when Charles Lyell published his seminal Principles of Geology, the foundation of that field. And in that document he said, the forces which shaped the planet in the past are the same ones which are operational for the most part at present. And because those forces operate very slowly, the planet had to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years older than anyone imagined. So what this gentleman provided for scholars, for lay people, was the concept of deep time, that the Earth was very old and that therefore all forms of life upon it, including humans, were far older than anyone imagined. At the same time he was writing, a series of scholars began to investigate the origins of the oldest Europeans. Interested as they were in the first French, the first Spanish, the first English, they began a series of excavations in which they began to recover artifactual material deeply buried along river systems in Europe, and found that material closely associated with the remains of now extinct animals. Though they had no way of dating these finds, the fact that those animals were no longer extant suggested to those scholars a very deep antiquity for Europeans. Soon their publications, notably the work of a man named Jacques Boucher, Crèvecoeur de Perth, mostly in the literature referred to simply and mercifully as Boucher de Perth, was circulated in the United States, and American scholars and Canadian scholars began to look for what they thought was equally old evidence of humans in the New World, not realizing that the seat of humankind was Africa, and from there, humans dispersed to all other parts of the world, oftentimes much later than their original tool-using appearance there. In any case, between the Civil War and the 1900s, American scholars were running around looking for an equivalent of the European Paleolithic. Two gentlemen, William Henry Holmes at the Bureau of American Ethnology and Eilish Hrdlicka, who founded the Department of Physical Anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution, said, "None of these putatively early sites are really early." And in point of fact, he believed, they believed, and the received wisdom as of 1900 was, there was no Ice Age human presence in the New World at all. That the first Americans had crossed the Bering Straits after the ice had retreated, and that they had arrived here no earlier than 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. It was realized at the time that Lyell was publishing that one of the forces which shaped the planet in the past were the frequent excursions of glacial ice across the landscape. And this ice trapped enormous amounts of water in the form of ice on land, causing sea levels to be sharply depressed, in some instances on the order of 300 feet. When this occurred, it created land bridges between areas which are no longer connected. One such land bridge was the long posited connection between northeastern Asia and Alaska that De Acosta thought must have existed. It was called the Bering Platform, or Beringia, and it was in some cases more than 1,000 kilometers across. So that humans moving across it from west to east would have never known they were changing continents, as animals had done for countless millennia beforehand. In any case, William Henry Holmes and Hrdlicka and Chamberlain and many others said they never used this bridge. It was already submerged. And so the new date for the peopling of the New World became roughly 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. At that time, anyone who disagreed with that point of view, as in your own respective present or former professions, was looked at somewhat askance as either being ill-educated or fundamentally stupid. There were several individuals who did believe in an Ice Age presence, and their presence and belief would ultimately be vindicated. In 1909, the gentleman on the left, a black cowboy named George McJunkin, was out looking for lost cattle in a place romantically named Wild Horse Arroyo near Folsom, New Mexico. Eroding out of the bank of that arroyo, or dry gully, he saw the bones of an animal which he believed were much too large for any cow, and far larger than the handful of bison that still lived in New Mexico at the time. He collected these materials, took them back to his bunkhouse, where they would languish until after World War I, indeed until after he was deceased. By a circuitous series of routes, this discovery made its way to one of the few individuals who believed in an earlier than 9,000 BP human presence in the New World. A gentleman named Jesse D. Figgins, who was the curator of paleontology at the Denver Museum of Natural History. Figgins went back to the site of the original discovery of McJunkin, conducted a series of excavations there in the 1920s, and recovered projectile points, spear points like the one shown on the right, intercalated with, intermixed with, stuck into the bones of these extinct bison. Even though this was more than 20 years before radiocarbon dating would be invented that would provide a more precise age for this material, on geological grounds it was very clear that these humans who made those points and those animals were living together at the end of the last ice age at least 10,000, if not more, years ago. And that, very briefly, became the new benchmark. It also subtly introduced the stereotype we've labored with for more than a century, that the be-all and end-all of Ice Age lifeways was the fashioning of stone tools by men, and men doing what men are supposed to do, sticking them into whatever is around. And man the hunter, with the emphasis on man, became the prevailing paradigm to explain Ice Age behavior, not just in the New World, but all over the planet. Nowhere in that equation were there any women, was there a place for children of either gender or older people of either gender. And naturally there are a variety of reasons for this, not the least of which was the fact that 99.99% of the scholars doing the research were men, mostly because of the tyranny of preservation. Only stone tools were being recovered from archaeological sites, and in the middle of the 19th century, even the budding British social anthropologists in that field recognized that the manufacture of stone tools was usually, not always, associated with men. So you have that multiple bias operational. Barnum Brown, a paleontologist at the American Museum of Natural History in 1924, stood up in front of an audience like this and said, "I have the answer to the prehistory of humankind in the New World here in my hand," which he would, but only for a couple of years. 3 years later, at a place called Blackwater Draw, locality number 3 in New Mexico near the town of Clovis, archaeologists recovered spear points like the one shown in the lower left, larger than the so-called Folsom points, thicker, but also characterized by that channel flake or fluting on both sides, which were soon discovered, and indeed prior to this had been discovered over much of, but not all, of unglaciated North America. These points extend on down into Mexico, Central America, and even into parts of South America. They became the fundamental emblem of a new model for looking at the peopling of the New World, which essentially is called Clovis First. It said the people that made these projectile points came over about 12,000 years ago, sprinted in a remarkably short time to the tip of South America, and left in their wake 35 genera of extinct Ice Age animals. Despite the fact that Europeans were highly critical of this, as well as South American prehistorians, North American prehistorians, Canadian and US born, loved it, particularly the males, and it became the gospel until the early 1970s. So there's two aspects to Clovis First. One is chronological, nobody before 12,000 years ago. The other is behavioral. They were rapidly moving, highly specialized, big game hunters who focused on now extinct animals. Next slide. I enter into the picture in a rather circuitous way. During my graduate work at the University of Utah, I was told by my not-so-gentle mentor, Jesse D. Jennings, who was not for nothing called the Dark Lord of the Desert, that I would either become intimately familiar with perishable artifacts, basketry, cordage, textiles, and the like, or I would pursue my education at another institution. Quickly I learned the wisdom of his words, and for the last 40-odd years, I have probably examined more prehistoric basketry and the like than anyone who ever lived. Why it's important here is, I was never intending to be a specialist in the early time periods of North American prehistory, and instead of focusing on the durable artifacts normally associated with males, I focused on artifacts normally associated both ethnographically in the recent past and prehistorically with females. So I have a rather different take on the technology of the time than I would have if I fondled stone tools alone. In 1971, I had a postdoc at the Smithsonian Institution where, yes, I was looking at more baskets. I became aware of a vacancy at Pitt at the time, and what Pitt was looking for was an archaeologist to reestablish their temporarily defunct archaeological field program in southwestern Pennsylvania, who would at the same time train students from other fields, related fields, geology, sedimentology, paleobotany, and so forth, in the protocols of modern field science, and at the same time explore the prehistory of the area and its environmental evolution. Because I had research commitments on the island of Cyprus, I did not have time to physically go out and find a place to do this work. I circulated word amongst my colleagues in this part of the state. A now deceased historian at California State College, now California State University, named Phil Jack, called me and told me about Meadowcroft Rockshelter, which I visited for the first time in April of 1973. For reasons that will shortly be apparent to you, or if you have been to the site for reasons which you are already familiar with, upon seeing the site we immediately decided to solicit permission from the Meadowcroft Foundation to begin excavations there. Meadowcroft Rockshelter sits, if you can go back to that last slide, please. Meadowcroft Rockshelter sits 46 kilometers southwest of Pittsburgh in what has always been an unglaciated part of the Allegheny Plateau. It is west of the Valley and Ridge province of the Appalachian Mountains. It is north and west of the Appalachian Basin. Running from northeast to southwest in that picture, or from upper right to lower left, you see a series of hatched and dotted lines which represent the position of the glacial front during the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. At the time, the ice was where you see it indicated, and if you're driving north on 79, it is at Moraine State Park. The ice over Erie was 2 miles thick. The Bering Land Bridge was 600 plus kilometers across, and there was ample opportunity for human populations to enter the New World at that particular moment in time. The area in which Meadowcroft is located is what geographers call maturely dissected. It means that more than 50% of it is in hilltop, and a minority of it is in valley bottom. For human populations moving from the Ohio River to the interior of Pennsylvania or vice versa, they are funneled down one of these east-west trending drainages, which would have brought them in direct proximity to Meadowcroft if they chose the Cross Creek drainage to make that particular trip. So not only is the area unglaciated, it's on a natural strategic access-egress waterway that would have facilitated human movement back and forth to the Ohio. The Ohio is only 12.22 kilometers, or a little more than 6 miles, west of Meadowcroft, Cross Creek, upon the north bank of which Meadowcroft sits, joins the Ohio River at Wellsburg. This is a view of the rock shelter in the upper right that was taken in 1973, facing west toward the Ohio. The vegetation that you see to the left or south marks the modern overhang of the rock shelter. More than 70,000 years ago, the Cross Creek stood above the sandstone that constitutes the roof and walls of the rock shelter. It gradually cut down through that sandstone and then reached a much softer shale, the Birmingham Shale, at which point it began to meander back and forth across the valley, producing a reentrant or overhang beneath which protection is afforded from the elements. At Meadowcroft, that overhang's current position is marked by the vegetation. To the left or south it is wet, to the right or north it is dry. In this slide, facing east, you see the vegetation once again. To the right or south it is wet, to the left or north it is dry. Inside, the modern overhang is about 55 square meters of protected floor space, a little bigger than this room compressed, okay? The big rock you see in the upper left fell down about 12,000 years ago. The rock that you see here fell down between about AD 300 and 600. As I'll be pointing out to you, the physical configuration of the rock shelter was constantly changing through time, so that visitors to it would have never come back to exactly the same place twice. In the lower left is a view looking up into the rock shelter, taken from a channel bar in Cross Creek. Those blocks that you see on the edge of the stream came down about 19,000 years ago, at which point in time the roof of the rock shelter was 3 to 5 times bigger than it is presently, would have been more commodious, would have accommodated more people, potentially for longer visits. This little weakly developed terrace is about 22,000 years old. Had there been anyone in the area, to use very convoluted subjunctives, they could have lived there after 22,000 years ago. Prior to that time, because of a plug, a sediment plug at Cross Creek, a small still stand lake would have flooded the rock shelter. And that lake did not disappear until after 22,000 years ago. Next slide. This is a schematic of the overhang. That overhang is composed of 2 different kinds of sandstone. The upper point bar sequence number 2 is very fragile. It is cemented with calcium carbonate. It consists of individual quartz grains and a little bit of mica and feldspar. As the cement breaks down, the sediment rains down onto the surface of the site. so that if you were prone to camp there and left your debris behind you in an untidy fashion, the sedimentation would rather quickly cover it up in a couple of years, and the record of your visit would be sealed geologically. What it turned out to be in those very deep deposits were thousands of separate visits to the rock shelter, each one of which sealed from the one above and below it by this continuous rain of sediment. Next slide. We were interested not only in the behavior of the actors and actresses of antiquity, but upon the stage they performed. So we unraveled, or tried to unravel, the geological history of the entire drainage, and then focused on the immediate prehistory of the rock shelter itself. In the upper left, Jack Donahue, the project geologist, David Clark, one of the field foremen, are in the process of taking geological samples from the cliff face to find out if there's enough variation in composition of that sandstone so that when you would find a rock in the site, you would be able to match up the point from which it detached, and because it was lying upon a radiocarbon dated surface, know when it came down, and therefore enabling the scholar to reconstruct the size and shape of the rock shelter over the span of time that it existed, and that proved to be the case. Now, when big parts of the roof fall down, as you might guess, it opens the site to other kinds of erosion, namely that carried by rainfall that sweeps sheet wash into the site. And so we installed a series of troughs to gauge the volume and kind of material that was coming into the rock shelter from that particular source. There were countless other geological and geochemical sampling techniques, all of which were designed to give us as clear a picture as possible of the nature of the place in which humans were acting before they were there, while they were there, after they were there. Next slide. The first trench, if you will, the first excavation began well outside the modern drip line on the edge of the talus slope and then proceeded north into the interior. Almost immediately it became apparent that that grain by grain erosion of sand grains, which we call attrition, was punctuated at various points in the past by the detachment of roof blocks, beginning with fist-sized blocks, progressing to larger and larger ones, culminating in those massive roof collapses like the ones I showed you. And then the process would begin over and over again. And each time it happened, it changed the configuration of the rock shelter. And so we focused on isolating and identifying those events. It also became apparent soon that the rock shelter was exceptionally deep, that the deposits were in excess of 16 feet, contrary to all the common wisdom of the time, because most of the rock shelters in western Pennsylvania, previously excavated, most of the ones in adjacent West Virginia and Ohio, were both shallow and not very old. Now bear in mind, I'm not talking about the fact that any of us believed at the time we initially went there that for the things that attracted us to the site, and in addition to its strategic location, they included that large commodious overhang, the top of which was more than 13 meters above the floor of the site, which meant that any fires you lit in the interior were rapidly and efficiently ventilated. It also meant that there was permanent drinking water available both from pre-pollution Cross Creek and springs that are located and still flow on both sides of the site. The floor or surface of the site was 15.06 meters above the creek, which means no matter how much of a flood event occurred, it could not be inundated. And in fact, after 22,000 years ago, it never was inundated again. So the site is high, dry, spacious, strategically located, using essentially Native American survival techniques. All of you could live indefinitely in Cross Creek even now. And of course, the modern abundance of wild plant and animal foods is a dim reflection of the circumstances which obtained here prehistorically. So for all those reasons, we were certain the site would have been used prehistorically. There are 11 layers at Meadowcroft that differ widely in consistency and thickness. Some have a lot of rockfall in them, some have very little. Some are mainly sand, some are largely clay, and they are detectable not so much by their colors, but by their texture. It would be as if the 10 or 15 layered dessert that you consume occasionally when you're being excessive to yourselves, you detected by feel alone. So you knew where the crust was, you knew where the icing was, you knew where the cake was. Well, essentially our excavators are doing the same thing. They're delimiting those layers based on texture. And it became readily apparent that there were 11 of them at this site, the deepest of which is culturally sterile. There's nothing in it that is associated with humankind, and the other 10 bear evidence of human visits. Next slide. Before we constructed the first of what would become a large series of buildings over the excavations to facilitate excavations in inclement weather, and also to make sure that the site was not despoliated naturally or by humans in the course of the rest of the year, it became apparent that that first trench running north to south had gone to depths that we never anticipated. And that in fact, and those tags mark, various cultural phenomena in the site, like prehistoric fireplaces, like prehistoric activity areas where the Native Americans would have been engaged in one or another activity, like places where we had taken geological or geochemical samples. And to orient yourselves, in one of the earlier slides you saw a historic fireplace that the keen-eyed among you might have noted was replete with aluminum flip-top beer cans of 1973 vintage. Here, that historic fireplace is located approximately in the center of the picture, right above a whole series of late prehistoric fireplaces. And as we removed that, we came down on rock falls, confirming for us that not only were rock fall events critical recently, but they extended far back into the past. And the one you see being exposed there is about 5,500 years old. We're all spread across this room because it's this big. If you would have come in here and found half the size room, half of you would not have been here, or the rest would have been thoroughly uncomfortable, and we would have used this space differently. And we focused on space issues precisely to understand how they were constrained by how much available floor space there was in terms of when they came to the site, what they did there, how long they stayed, and so on. Next slide. In addition to some 20,000 artifacts, the easiest way to detect a human presence at this location takes the form of pits of varying configurations. Now, all of you know that the prehistory of eastern North America is divided into a series of sequent time intervals that overlap slightly, the first one of which is called Paleo-Indian. It begins whenever the first Native Americans got here and extends to the end of the last ice age, about 10,500 years ago. During that time, human populations are largely migratory. Among the things that they hunt are now extinct big game animals, as well as some kinds of animals that are still around. There begins a long archaic, from 10,500 years ago to roughly 3,000 years ago, during which modern vegetation establishes itself, modern animal communities establish themselves. The populations are still largely migratory, but they're growing in number, and they're staying longer in particular places. Then, with the introduction of domesticated plants of external origin, corn, beans, and squash, and some local domesticates like sunflower and sumpweed, the woodland period begins with settled village life and ultimately culminates only when the Europeans arrive and either killing them or driving them to points further west. The point here is these fire pits cover a wide range of those time periods. The one in the upper left is of late woodland age. It was for the storage of hickory nuts. The two on the bottom are roasting pits of differing configuration attributable to the archaic. In the upper right is a living surface, a surface upon which Native Americans walked, sat, slept, did things that stained and discolored by ash and charcoal from their activities. I pointed out to you because the site essentially consists of floor after floor after floor after floor of that kind of thing. Next slide. One of the things that's unique about some of the later occupations at the site is the fact that the Native Americans who used it either on purpose or accidentally incinerated large areas, either to drive off vermin or pestiferous insects, or because sparks from their fireplace ignited the vegetal trash on the surface. Those surfaces are perilously thin. In many instances, they're thinner than the edge of a trowel blade, and so our excavators, at a time when you could, bluntly, torture students way more than you can now, would work with single-edged razor blades 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for 3 months, excavating surfaces like this one. You can only imagine, for those of you that are prone to such things, how at the end of the day our crews who did this, who were of age, took great pleasure in the fact that Avella at the time sported 7 prosperous saloons, to whose economy we unfortunately contributed mightily on occasion. Next slide. This is one of the 2 major excavation areas, and if you visit the site now, or if you have visited it, you have seen this. It's the east profile. It's about 16 feet of sediment. It represents the last 11,500 years of human presence, what geologists call the Holocene, and the tail end of the last ice age or Pleistocene. To cut that wall further east, 25 centimeters, took a full crew 90 days to do. So there it is in 74, next slide. There it is a year later, and it's only moved back from where that tag is on the floor. To give you an idea that when you go and see the Indiana Jones movies, you don't see this kind of mind-numbing tedium. The collection and documentation of data that goes on in the excavation of sites like this. Next slide. If you're the excavator, this is what it looks to you close up. The tan layer that you see in the center has 63 separate depositional units in it. In other words, it's composed of 63 separate episodes. If you liken the whole stratum to a chapter in a book, those individual episodes are like its pages. And we would peel them off one at a time with their contents and date them so that we can understand the subtle changes in the environment, the plants, the animals, and what people are doing there. Next slide. There's a person at work in the more recent past, razor blade in hand, cutting away a level that is less than a couple of millimeters thick. Next slide. This is pretty much what the profile looks like today. As of 1978, the main excavations were between 73 and 78, then again in 82, 83, 85, 87, on into the 90s, and most recently last year. The site has been under continuous excavation, or continuous examination, since June of 73. Next slide. One of the things that we were able to do there, because the University of Pittsburgh invested large amounts of money in this enterprise, and later on, so did the National Science Foundation, the National Geographic Society, local foundations like Alcoa, Mellon, Buell, was to do things here that had never previously been done before, like enclose the site in a series of buildings, installing an experimental lighting system in the rock shelter that allowed the excavators to dial up or mute particular combinations of lights so that they could have the hue, intensity, and chroma of the lights in their area different. And this gives you an idea by juxtaposing these 2 slides together how different light sources let you, the excavator, see different things. We also installed a telephone in the rock shelter connected by modem to the mainframe at Pitt so we could computerize data instantaneously. We set up a series of geological processing facilities nearby so samples could be analyzed very quickly. We did a whole series of things that the level of funding and the expertise of the staff permitted us to do, allowing us to focus in on those fundamental questions. Who are these people? When did they get here? Where did they come from? And what were they doing? Next slide. For every hour you spend physically excavating, you're going to spend anywhere from 10 to 15 hours documenting and analyzing material. Part of our documentation process was the construction of these profile maps of the faces of the excavation, the artist's colors for which do not denote the color of the sediment, but instead each color stands for a different combination of silt, sand, and clay-sized material. So if it is predominantly sand, you use this color, and if it's predominantly clay, you use that color, and so on. There are thousands of those maps, which took literally thousands of hours to produce, so that when we look at them, we can reconstruct the excavation process, because you all know that as you excavate a site, you destroy it. If it is not properly documented, why do it at all? Next slide. As you move outside the modern overhang to the second major excavation area at the site, The color distinctions between the strata are lost, but the textural distinctions remain, so we can follow those layers all the way down the hillside. We can also, using various geochemical sampling techniques, track the retreat of the roof through time and know where its position was at any point in its 16,000 plus year occupational history. Next slide. The other main area we worked is the so-called deep hole, where there are a series of ice age deposits, and I think because we're using this variety of PowerPoint and not the other one, these slides are not meant to be superimposed like this, but in any case, that surface looking north was under a rock fall that essentially dates to Clovis times. Beneath it, conventional wisdom said there should be nothing, neither traces of humankind or evidences of human behavior. We removed that rock because we wanted to reach the Birmingham Shale and understand what it looked like, not because any of us thought there would be older material. As soon as the rock was mapped and peeled off, a continued human presence was clearly visible on that surface. Next slide. It took the form, and again, I'm sorry about this, there are a series of shallow circular fireplaces that represent overnight camping events, only a few of which are large and rock-lined and only one of which was reused, which provided a series of radiocarbon determinations in 1974 that actually and momentarily forced the Washington Post's coverage of the sad Nixon resignation event off their own front pages, and they published the Meadowcroft radiocarbon dates that suggested human beings had been here in southwestern Pennsylvania for at least 1,500 years longer than anyone had hitherto imagined. Next slide. On that same surface, and these are meant again to be sequential, there are a series of artifacts of unique properties, one of which is shown in the far right. Those artifacts have little in common except superficially with Clovis materials. Next slide. The projectile point in the upper left, called the Miller Point after Albert Miller, one of the property owners, is much resharpened, and originally its length was considerably greater than what you see here. In the lower right are a series of related items found with it. The Miller Point is vaguely lanceolate in shape, like a Clovis or a Folsom Point, but it is flat-based, it is unfluted, and it is considerably older. The items on the lower right represent other stone tools from the deep layers that come from a remarkable array of quarry sources. The black material on the far right is from West Virginia, the pink material is from Flint Ridge in Ohio, the material in the center is from the Onondaga outcrops in New York, and the material on the left is local Cross Creek chert or flint. The point here is that not were these populations going over such a vast area, but they were probably exchanging products with people who lived over this vast area, and that these exchange networks were a very ancient occurrence in the eastern United States. Next slide. This is a sampling of the tools from the oldest levels at the site, the old levels that are older than Clovis. They're mainly the kind of impedimenta that you would associate with the acquisition and processing of plant and animal foods. Nothing pretty spectacular, but clearly all of human agency. Unique among them are these small so-called blade flakes or bladelets, long, thin pieces of chert that are about twice as long as they are wide, struck from carefully prepared blade cores in a manner distinctly different than Clovis, but more consistent with the kind of blades that were being produced in North China and Northeast Asia more than 30,000 years ago. This blade technology produces these small implements which in the upper right are dulled on the lower side, used on the sharp side, but they're set into handles made of antler or bone or wood and in tandem, like setting a series of razor blades together, not using, as we forced our poor students to do, individual razor blades. These kind of composite tools are of deep antiquity in the old world, and they would have been part and parcel of the armamentarium brought across the Bering Straits by the first Americans. Next slide. That's a blade core from which those blades are struck. You take a piece of suitable chert, place it in a wooden vise, put a punch on the edge of the top of the core, strike it with a hammerstone, and if you do everything right, the blade comes off. Then you move over and take another and another and another until the core is exhausted. Next slide. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. In this particular case, the unfortunate napper, male or female, shattered the punch, it's reconstructed in the lower right, snapped the blade core, yelled out the appropriate four-letter word, threw it on the ground where it would lay for 13,500 years. Next slide. Fortunately, though the site is not particularly dry, you do have slightly better preservation than you have in other eastern U.S. caves and rock shelters. So we got a smidgen of the kinds of items that were being manufactured here other than stone. In the upper left, a wooden bi-point. In the upper right, a trigger from a bent twig snare trap. Next to it, part of a fish hook. Next to it, part of a bead stock out of bird bone used to make beads, and then part of a bone button. And tickling my perverse perishable-oriented heart, burned basketry from several of the levels, all of which give you some dim insights into what people other than males might have been doing at this location. Next slide. For those interested in earlier time periods, the entire evolution of corn in the upper Ohio Valley is represented here. In the upper right, or the right side, a 16-row primitive popcorn of Mexican origin, and on the far left, an 8-row high-yielding piece of corn, such as would have been used at the time Europeans arrived in the area. The excavations at Meadowcroft produced 956,000 animal bones, representing 135 different species. It also produced more than 20,000 mollusks of various kinds, both snails from the river and the streams nearby, as well as terrestrial snails, countless varieties of birds, reptiles, amphibians, 1.4 million plant remains, including quite literally all of the contemporary non-introduced plant community and much of the late Ice Age, early Holocene plant community, the sum total of which lets us speculate very clearly, or demonstrate very clearly, what these people are actually doing upon their arrival at the site and later on. Next slide. There are 52 radiocarbon dates from Meadowcroft. As you know, as long as any of us are alive, any air-breathing organisms, we absorb radioactive carbon-14 from the atmosphere as part of the respiration process. As soon as we croak, this radiocarbon begins to break down at the rate of 1/2 of its mass every 5,730 years. By measuring the amount that's left in a piece of wood, in a bone, or what have you, you have an estimate of the age of death of that particular organism. These radiocarbon dates begin 22,000 years ago, before humans are living in the rock shelter. They mark the first human presence around 16,000 radiocarbon years ago, and thereafter they continue up till AD 1775, at which point the historic record begins. Presently, this is the longest radiocarbon sequence in North or South America. Next slide. Where does that take us? Among other things, it takes us here. The Clovis model doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work behaviorally. It doesn't work chronologically. It's not just Meadowcroft now, but dozens of other sites in North and South America that have breached the Clovis barrier, indicating, among other things, that there were many, not a lot, but many more instances of a human presence here before Clovis became the visible end of the peopling spectrum. More importantly, the technology, the associated plant and animal material from these sites, and Meadowcroft is but one of them, indicate a very different set of orientations to the landscape. Rather than exclusively pursuing big game animals by mature-aged males, you have evidence of broad spectrum collecting of plants and animals of all sizes and all dimensions, from elk and extinct forms all the way down to ground squirrels and rodents, the consumption of nuts, seeds, and fruit in a very diverse dietary orientation in which females would have played a critical role. Because it is less exciting than standing in front of a mammoth with a spear, You're not going to go to a museum and see a reconstruction of a Paleo-Indian woman stalking the savage wild carrot. But it's a more critical aspect of the life way than we had ever heretofore believed until the last 30 years. Next slide. All of us at different times have been bombarded with imagery like this. Images in which, again, an exclusive group of males, and there's some accuracy to this. That's the ice front near Erie during its retreat. You can see the massive thickness of it. You can see the top actually blanketed with sediment and vegetation. You can see a proglacial lake out in front of it. You can see white-tailed deer, which were part of that landscape, along with mammoths. And then these gentlemen in the foreground wearing tailored clothes, and of course, doing that most manly of things, hacking off uncooked meat with a stone tool and eating it. The guy on the right, who knows, with his off-the-shoulder look in the middle of the Ice Age, presenting a somewhat different picture of male activities at the time, but nonetheless, there are no women, there are no children, and none of these guys was particularly old. Next slide. The excavations at Meadowcroft and places like Cactus Hill in Virginia, places like Galt and Deborah L. Friedkin in Texas, the Paisley Caves in Oregon, Monteverde and other sites in South America now show us that the nature of the peopling process was dramatically different than what we had heretofore believed and so reluctantly discarded only in the last few decades. Instead of a single migration 12,000 years ago, there appears to have been a multiplicity of movements by people with different technologies, different ethnicities, different linguistic and genetic backgrounds from Northeast Asia, some of whom did cross the Bering Straits on dry land, others who sailed along its southern margins, some of whom moved into the interior of North America down the Mackenzie River and ended up on the east side of the Rockies, others who went all the way to the tip of South America by a coastal route, some who crossed at Panama and then came up the other way through the Gulf. But the point is, the picture that's emerging right now is infinitely more complex than we ever imagined it to be. Humans have probably been here twice as long as the previous model suggested, and more importantly, we know that the success of that colonization moment was due not just to the activity of mature males, but to the entire social unit. A social unit that would have included children of both genders, men and women, working with a very diversified technology that was not focused on any one thing, but instead made possible the largest colonization effort in the history of the world that will ever occur until we leave and if we leave this planet. Next slide. That is a view of Meadowcroft Rockshelter as it looks today. If you have never been there, that's the new building over the site. And as the caption says, you can only imagine what its visitors 16,000 years ago would have thought about this architectural phenomena. I suggest to you, finally, that in the Indiana Jones movies, they do capture the romance of archaeology in an incredibly unique way, even if it's inaccurate methodologically. The picture of the peopling of the New World that emerges from Meadowcroft is even more exciting in a sense because people who came here are descendants of folks who crossed the Bering Straits and for the first time realized all the smoke was behind them. They were the first people in a new world. It gets no more romantic than that. Thank you for your patience.
Anyone like a diploma? Mike?
Were human bones found?
No, here's an interesting thing. Since the excavations began in '73, perhaps 30,000 people have visited the site. And in those sequent visits, scaling the hill, which is about a 17-degree grade, no one has ever died. And I point it out because the statistical odds of visitors coming to the site as they did prehistorically for a couple of days at a time, from late August to early November, really didn't afford the odds of dying there being very high, and no one apparently did. So there are no burials. The only human remains are discarded worn teeth.
I'm interested in your picture of the corn evolution. So you say it starts with the...
It starts with a 16-row Mexican, a popcorn of Mexican origin.
Yes.
Whether it came up the Ohio Valley from the Gulf or crossed overland along the Texas coast, we're not really certain. But the earliest corn is a really low yield, really small cob variety. And then there's a lot of, as you know, a lot of selection going on. Ultimately, that 8-row variety of pod corn puts in its appearance first well to the south and west of us. Later on, it becomes established here, and that's the kind of corn Native Americans are growing.
So was it carried as seed, or do you think...
Those are excellent questions. We're not really sure. For instance, in the American Southwest, which is the first place to get Mexican domesticates, we're not sure if it involves actual population movement or if it involves the transfer of items that have seed in them, or what. Because demonstrating human movement across the landscape is one of the toughest things to do archaeologically in the absence of written records. We know that Mexican baskets begin to show up in the Southwest at roughly the same time as Mexican domesticates. It may be that they're being physically carried there by Native Americans of Mexican origin, or they're just exchanging things group to group. I'm not sure what the attractiveness might have been. For instance, if you're a planter, your hunter-gatherer neighbors don't plant, you say, have I got the answer for you? Try this out. They could just as soon eat you as plant the corn, but the point is, we're not sure. The answer to that, well, we just don't know how those domesticates actually proliferate. Yes, ma'am.
So you speculate that the rock shelter was visited in the late summer of every year?
Right. The seeding time for the seeds that we have in the deposits, they're eating a lot of hackberries, which now some of you grow in your yards as ornamentals, but formerly were much more common in pre-industrial forest situations. They're eating goosefoot and other small chenopods. They're eating lots of other vaccinium and rubus and berries, different kinds. They're all fall available things. There's very little evidence of a winter occupation. There's no evidence of a summer occupation. They may be there a little bit in the spring because you get bird eggs in some of the deposits. But essentially, these are short visits by people who are coming there to collect wild plant and animal foods, exhaust the area, and move on. Even after villages appear, they're still coming out of the villages to harvest this wild stuff. Yes?
You said you're still excavating?
Well, periodically we go back, and we've recently gone back because the walls of the site have never been chemically stabilized, and they dry out and crack, and sometimes in order to keep them from collapsing, we'll cut them back further. We've left a third of the site untouched because the protocols that are invented literally daily for getting more information out of the site. As one of the gentlemen pointed out before we started, modern archaeology takes great use of scientific techniques developed in other fields these days. I would not say it's a science yet itself, but it nonetheless constantly borrows technologies from other areas, and that permits us to do things in 2012 we couldn't do in 1973. So a large chunk of the site is still left.
Is it being considered for UNESCO Heritage Site?
Yeah, it's, in fact, an application went in the not too distant past. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned other technologies are incorporating other things. Have you done any kind of non-invasive imaging?
Originally, during the beginning of the operations, when resistivity and conductivity were in their infancy, basically, we did not have the opportunity to do that. Later on, we ground truthed and also remote sensed some of the area unexcavated on the western edge of the site to see what the subsurface distribution of rockfall might be, because conditioning where your trenches go and not having to reduce those rocks overly is important to us. But during the major excavations, we didn't do that.
Yeah, it
Yes.
looks like you've got a vertical wall going through all the layers,
It's true.
and then you're going through it. Wouldn't it be better to start above and slowly go down?
Well, in effect, we do that, but it's in a limited area. And so when you do it in a limited area, say a meter thick, you're going down layer by layer, but you're leaving a profile on both sides, which gives you a three-dimensional control over it. You're not only on a surface, you can see the surfaces on both sides of it that are above it. And so it lets you have Cartesian control over the excavation, basically. Yes, sir.
So why are there people here 2,000 miles from the west coast? You know, there isn't population.
Well,
I don't think.
consider how human beings generally spread across the landscape. It's not in many instances, though there's some interesting cases where it is something I'm telling you this case doesn't represent. Colonization, the way we look at it as an intentional thing, Columbus saying, well, I'm going to sail to the East Indies, we're going to go over the horizon, is a relatively, except in one dramatic instance, recent phenomenon. Instead, hunter-gatherers have very dispersed populations in areas where it's pretty easy to exceed carrying capacity. And so what you're dealing with is continuous range expansion, as with the species, as with coyotes spreading from the southwest into our own backyard. Humans are expanding their range between about 20-some thousand years ago and the end of the last ice age, and it gradually incorporates all of North America and South America. The exception is the one in which the colonization of Australia, which was never connected to the Southeast Asian mainland, had to be one of those on-purpose events. Somebody in New Guinea said, let's build one of our watercraft that we use up and down the coast, and we're going out there over the horizon to wherever those birds are flying to. That's the one exception that I can think of, and then later on, of course, the Polynesians with much better sophisticated technology colonized the Central Pacific. But it's range expansion, it's not intentional movement. Yes, sir?
How old was the oldest corn that you found?
The oldest corn dates to about 400 BC, which is pretty much consistent with the earliest pollen evidence from other places like Ohio and Illinois, and then a few radiocarbon years later you have actual kernels from some other eastern sites. It never gets to be a big deal around here until much later. It becomes a buffer in times of stress. You've got it, and if something doesn't eat it, and if you give it minimal care, you're going to get a crop. But it never assumes the importance in this particular area that it did historically until pretty late, when they're starting to be fully dependent on it. As population sizes build up and they get sedentary communities, they begin to expand the area under cultivation, which in turn causes the local transfer of the landscape from one that is primarily filled with wild plants and animals to one that's filled with domesticates.
Well, how early did the Aztecs or whatever?
Well, the earliest evidence of some domestication in South America and Central America is in excess of 7,000 radiocarbon years before Christ. So they're fooling around with that stuff thousands of years before they are here. And also because those are the places where these plants originate. Those are the places that have humans exposed to them earliest. Those are the places where selective breeding occurred first. Those are the places higher yielding domesticates appear first. It sets off, if you will, oversimplifying it, a chain of cultural complexity that is way different than what you see in this area.
Yeah.
Yes?
You form a picture of the culture and the development at any one of these layers. Can you speculate that there are layers over in Ohio or...
Well, they could not just plop into here, right?
Right, right.
So there have to be archaeological sites further west or further south or further east that are at least as old, if not older, and of course the further north you go, they have to be older. But the point is, finding these kind of sites on the landscape is extremely tough. Almost every site I mentioned to you was discovered by accident. We certainly didn't know early humans lived here. We knew somebody did, but not back then. Tom Dillahay's discoveries at Monteverde in South America entirely by accident. The excavations that have gone on at Cactus Hill in Virginia entirely by accident. So thin are those populations on the landscape that it's like finding a needle in a haystack. It's like saying, I'm going to go look here, which is why the geology becomes so important, because as one archaeologist cynically observed, you can't find ancient humans without finding ancient dirt. So if we can identify places where there's late Ice Age sediments, we're likely to find places where there are late Ice Age humans. But it's only in the last 20 years we started to do that. So it's been a very unsystematic, haphazard search up until 20 years ago.
So do you speculate that the people who lived in Meadowcroft had a range of maybe 20 miles around it, or do you think they moved in
one of the
huge
things,
circles?
there are several ways you can track ranges. One of them is you get the stone from the site and see how far from the nearest or furthest quarry it is, and assume if they went there themselves, and that's the big if, that that's the maximum size of their range. If you have distinctive artifacts that you can associate, as you can in places out west, basketry made by the same band at the same time, and you could track them across the landscape, it varies from area to area. In some parts of South America or the Pacific Northwest, where seafood resources are incredibly dense, the ranges are very small. You don't have to go anywhere. In other places where the range is depauperate, like northern Mexico, the ranges of the populations are hundreds of square miles. So I would imagine that the range of the people using Cross Creek was pretty small. Probably not as small as 20 square miles, but less than 100.
Did you have a question?
I was just gonna ask if there's a way you know where they were going or where they were coming from?
No, just as it's hard to track them across the landscape, figuring out where they are when they're not there would mean something that they made can be dated from somewhere else, and you can with confidence say it isn't parallel convergence, and you can say, well, this item indicates this band that used to be here is now over here, so no, we don't know where they're going. One would think in the snowbird mentality they're going south, but there's no way of really knowing that.
Why did the mound culture not come this far over? Or
Well,
did
actually it did. There were mounds in downtown Pittsburgh at the time that the forts existed there. There are a series of mound building phenomena that go all the way up to Lake Erie. They even trickle over into southern New York. But it's like the backwoods version of mound building. It's how you do it in the far, far sticks. And as you get closer to the homeland around Chillicothe in central Ohio, those mound complexes are much different. But the further away you get from the center, the more peripheral it gets. It's like tracing fashion from New York to Avella, Pennsylvania. Yes.
Let's take two or three more.
Are there DNA studies being made of the deep?
The teeth right now, when I moved from the University of Pittsburgh to Mercyhurst, the relocation of specimens, as you might guess when you're moving millions of items, took a while. It's only been in the last 2 years we've even refound the packages containing the teeth, but we intend to do that. What's interesting, a derivative of that question is, someone normally asks, do we know the ethnic identification of any of the sequent dwellers in the site? And the answer is no. Even the most recent folk, the so-called Monongahela culture, was already locally exterminated, probably by the Seneca, before Europeans got here. And so we don't even know the ethnic identity of the people living at the site in AD 1500, let alone 15,000 years before that.
Ellen, why don't we wrap up with you?
Is there a new starting date now for the first crossings? Or
Well, it all depends whose standards of evidence one wishes to employ. If you apply the most rigorous standards, then people are here by 20,000 years ago. They may have been here slightly before the last glacial maximum, which would make it into the higher 20s. There isn't a lot of evidence for people in Siberia before 30 or 35,000 years ago. So it's kind of an upper ceiling, even though it's one that changes with discoveries over there. No one has found anything in the New World convincingly older than 20,000 years ago yet. Thank you again.
Thank you. We've been doing this for 10 years. That's one of the most unusual lectures we've ever had here. Thank you. Just this, you have a brochure, the Squirrel Hill Project. A group down at Pitt, the Jewish Studies Center, was lucky enough to get a grant to study Squirrel Hill and its Jewish community over the next year. Adam Shear, who's a member of this group, is running this project. Barbara Burston will be the first speaker. She's spoken here and is a member. Look at the schedule, which starts next Sunday, October 14th. This is a group that eats up knowledge. Another free lecture at the JCC. Let's see what time. 6 p.m. next Sunday, the 14th, is the first of the lectures. They're gonna do a Jewish-oriented walking tour in the spring, and there are bringing in a lot of scholars from out of town. We're co-sponsoring this lecture series. I hope you take advantage of that, and come back next month and see us. Good night.